So, my name is Sarah, and I am a generalist. I am an over-enthusiast, and I'm going to be telling you about what I do, why I do it, and all of the mistakes I've made along the way. So, the first time that I heard the word startup was in 2006. At the time, I was working for a magazine called Go Girl, no comma, and spending my time doing mad things like taking Zac Efron go-karting and questioning my life choices. And a founder approached me and said, can you help me bring people together? I've heard that you're good at this. I've heard you do a lot of this outside of your day job. And I fell in love really with startups. But for someone like me who's got 2 arts degrees, wears pink dresses, that kind of thing, I didn't find it easy in the early days. I think particularly in East London, it was a very fragmented scene. A lot of the education was really tailored to an American audience. And it felt like many great things were happening behind closed doors. So I came to Google in 2011 to launch a big team around Google Maps, trying to make maps interactive and not passive, so the reviewing element there. And about the same time, I kept hearing about this idea for campus. It was a physical space, 7 stories, which at the time seemed massive, now seems a little bit too small. So this is campus. And if I had to give you a one-liner, I really think of it as being a hub to bring together founders and startups for them to help educate each other, grow, learn, and develop. And yes, as Herb mentioned, we do like our data, but this is not my specialism. I'm going to give you the stats really quickly and then tell you about the stories, which to me is far more fun. In the 4.5 years we've been going, we've built a community of 65,000. Companies based on our network have raised 71 million in VC funding and created almost 3,000 jobs in that time. So that's great. What does it practically mean? What do I do all day? In this 7-story building, this is our cafe space. So that membership is free, it's open access. And in terms of our members, they vary enormously. I was at a meetup yesterday morning, and I'll tell you about the first 3 people that I spoke to. The first was an ex-lawyer who's now developed a law tech startup that she created over a weekend hackathon. The second was a guy called Bertie, who just did a documentary around urban beekeeping. And the third was a guy in his 60s who's an actor who spent the last 30 years doing musical theatre and is just launching an app to help people in their 60s plus navigate cities. Honestly, those are the 3 people I spoke to yesterday morning. Amazing case studies. I was very grateful to them for being so interesting. So I knew that campus was going really well when somebody sent me a BuzzFeed article that was like, what entrepreneur stereotype are you? And one of the answers was, you work in the campus cafe. Great, that's good news, right? The second element is really our events. So I used to run a lot of events for entrepreneurs years ago, always in pubs, doesn't work for a diverse crowd, can't present. We've got 3 open access event spaces where anybody, whether they're an individual, a startup, a government, corporate, can apply. The criteria is the event has to be free because the space is free. The events, we prefer them to be open. And we curate really heavily. So we hosted about 750 events last year. Whether it's C-Camp's Investor Week, whether it's a weekend hackathon, whether it's hiring a UXer masterclass, it's really about helping linchpins in our community go further. The third thing is our partners. So again, in the spirit of collaboration, when we first launched Campus, we were the first big company running a space like this. We didn't know how to do everything by a really, really, really long way. In fact, we knew very little. So we brought in partners that we thought were doing amazing work. So Tech Hub, who run our 2 floors of co-working, C-Camp, who are an early stage investor who just released their amazing data points yesterday. They've funded about 230 companies, including TransferWise, who are now valued at $1 billion. And lastly, the programmatic piece, and that's what my very small team spend a lot of their time doing. There are 10 of us, and when we first launched, there were 2 of us. That was an enormous mistake that we made. We had no idea what running a space would feel like. Very Google, we were like, okay, let's throw 1 person at this and see if it works out. Turns out 1 person is not enough to run a 7-story space. The programs shift the entire time depending on what our community needs. But there are certain regular themes. So for example, every single Friday we do mentoring. We call it mentoring, but really it's about a 1-to-1 sense check. These are 30 minutes long, fast, fun, free, and it's topic-based. So this Friday is all about mobile payment systems. Next Friday is about customer acquisition strategies. And we bring over Googlers. We've got about 4,000 of them in London. It's a way of kind of making the most of their passion and enthusiasm in a way that we feel is meaningful for entrepreneurs too. And this is one of our longer form programs, Campus for Mums. I started this when I was a 20%er 4.5 years ago. So we have this funny thing at Google where you can spend 1 day a week on a side project. And for me, I was always infuriated that many of the spaces that I used to go to looked quite similar. And part of this is just the changing scene, but 4 or 5 years ago, it was still very often young guys in hoodies. There are still a lot of those at campus, but I'm really proud that our community is 38% female, 160 plus nationalities, age varies the entire time. This is a 10-week baby-friendly startup school where we select 35 mums and dads,
In our current cohort, we have people from SpaceX, Amazon, Nokia, all-female circus troops, very diverse. And over those 10 weeks, they learn to basically, by the end of it, they have a wireframe, a business plan, and some customer feedback. You know, we're now seeing founders from this group go into Techstars, going to be interviewing for YC, doing really well. And this is the first. London was the first, and we now have 6 around the world. And each of these tend to kind of work for the local market. So for example, in Seoul, it's still a land dominated by corporates. Founders there tend to be a little bit more radical than most because they're not working for Samsung. You have Warsaw, which is a very technical market. And you know, the founders there need help with sort of business, marketing, things that are outside the classic kind of techie realm. And I've just spent 4 months in Tel Aviv running our campus over there. Really interesting market, very different to London. Incredibly forward-thinking and don't need a lot of the kind of basic education that is still needed in most of our other campuses. So that's the basic what's, and I'm going to tell you a bit about the mistakes. So many mistakes. People always say to me, why does Google do this? So we don't make money from campus. We don't invest in companies based there. We don't acquire companies based there. We very much think of it as a long-term business strategy. You know, more entrepreneurs, it's transformative, better for the economy, better for us in the long term. And people also ask me, why don't you work with individual companies? Why do you work with communities? Because this is what my team, Google for Entrepreneurs, does. We help communities grow. And I think it was Steve Jobs who said that you never can put the dots together ahead of time. You always look back and realize what makes sense later. So I moved to rural India in 1998. I grew up on a farm in Gloucestershire, so that was a bit of a culture shock. I just got really excited about this country that I'd heard about quite sort of, you know, through stories, really. And on the first day, I was in Mumbai. I was really overwhelmed, city of 30 million people. And I was at a train station watching these boxes get put together. These are tiffin boxes. And every day, 200,000 workers in Mumbai get a hot lunch delivered to their desks. Normally, the food is made by their wives. Sorry, ladies, but that's just how Mumbai still works. And they are brought to these people's desks by this incredible system of symbols. And there are 17,000 tiffinwallahs in Mumbai who help make sense of these symbols and shift them from station to station to station. And it's like the most incredible automation. No individual could have made this happen. Only groups could make this happen. And that's what I think about with communities, is groups can always do what individuals can't. They can make things happen. I think many of us know that great ideas don't happen in these kind of eureka moments. They happen in networks, going back to Herb's topic for this session. And I always think about, when I was growing up, the way that we used to live, I always thought about it in quite a linear fashion. You know, you played till you were 6, you went to school, you went to university, you worked till you were 65, and then you retired. And partly that's a failure of my own imagination, but that really was how it seemed to be when I was younger. And we forget a lot of the time that our modern way of thinking about work has only been invented in the last 100 years. You know, you've got Henry Ford inventing the weekend back in the 20s to give his workers more time to spend money. It's such a shift now. I think all of us know people who have... Like, I've got a friend who's in their early 30s who's gone part-time to spend more time gardening. My dad is a 65-year-old developer who's got no intention of retiring anytime soon. I think we're seeing the way that we live and work being disrupted in an ongoing way, and that's why these spaces are really coming into their own. You know, it's really interesting to me that every year the average age at Campus London goes up. I keep waiting for it to overtake my age, but that may never happen. We're now at 34, so it's got a few more years to go. But every year, I think one of the UK's strengths, we have a lot of great industries. And we have a lot of people in their 30s to 50s to 60s leaving those companies to create companies to sell back into them, something Tel Aviv does not have. And more broadly, work is really in flux. I think one thing that really strikes me is spaces like campus offer lifelong learning. They offer ways to upskill yourself if you're already in a company. They offer ways to really immerse yourself in something entirely different to what you've been doing for your entire life. If you look at my early career, it doesn't make sense that I work in tech at all. It doesn't make sense I've managed engineers, but I have. And I think this is something the UK really has to work on more. I met an amazing lady last night called Dawn, who basically, shout out Dawn if you're here, who works with teachers to kind of get them upskilled on CS. They can go forth and teach young kids to code in different and creative ways. I think secondly, we're kind of seeing flatter hierarchies and weirder offices. So the last boss that I had, I interviewed her on the way in. Again, that was really exciting and empowering. And increasingly, we're seeing this move from, you know, I grew up in a comparatively material time in the 80s, but we're seeing this shift away from this kind of smash and grab consumerism. And I say this, I saw a lot of juice bars yesterday. I work surrounded by a lot of juice bars. I think we're seeing this kind of really interesting experience revolution where the mission of what we do, the why of what we do, is as important as the how and the what. And again, all of these things, these pictures are from Facebook HQ. all of these things are really front of mind in a space where you're surrounded by others who are trying to understand what their meaning and their purpose is. So, whether it's a village square, whether it's a coffee house, whether it's Westfield, whether it's a forum, whether it's Instagram, these are the connecting spaces that bring us together. And anyone who hasn't heard, Stephen Johnson has an amazing TED talk on this about how coffee houses helped make England really innovative in the 1600s. It's fantastic. But spaces like campus, and there are many versions of campus across the country. I'm thinking of Codebase in Edinburgh, Tech North in Newcastle, Impact Hub in Birmingham. These are spaces where people come together to make ideas happen, where these individual eureka moments are not as good as the ideas that happen over a coffee, in the lift, when you're debating something late at night. And we need to design better to make this happen in our workplaces too. So here are some lessons that we learned. I've only got 8 minutes and we got a lot of things wrong, so I'm gonna, bear with me, I'm gonna go fast. I think the first thing really is galvanizing what's already there. So this is Startup Weekend. They run weekend hackathons that get people excited about building companies. They do amazing things, particularly in emerging markets. I went to Gaza a couple of months back, and the first thing I saw when I walked in the door, bearing in mind they have this terrifying entry process. You get into Gaza, and the first thing I see when I walk in the door is a lot of Startup Weekend t-shirts. That's cool. It's a very rare community that's starting something entirely fresh. There will always be somebody fantastic doing something before you. So I think my first tip would be to galvanize what's already there, work with these linchpins. And particularly in London with campus, we, like I said, it was a pilot for us. We had no idea what we were doing. We went out, we did a listening tour, we tried to understand what the needs were. And needs are always changing and shifting, right? So we heard early on people needed space to come together. We also heard they needed co-working. We had no idea how to do that. So we chose to partner with somebody who was really great at that rather than try and do it ourselves. And I think really this is about being community first. That's my number one spot for any leader, any owner of any community, not that I think you can necessarily own them, is to kind of always be listening, always be prepared to shift and flex, and always understand that you are, try and be humble about these things. You're not necessarily the first. I think in London, being a large company launching a space, we were really aware of how it would look if we kind of came in and said, we know everything, we'll teach you how to do it. That was very much not what we were trying to get across at all. I think the second lesson is around not owning culture or communities. I'm really of the belief that you can't over-communicate top-down what you hope to get from a culture. So for example, in our cafe, 65,000 members, we've only ever asked 2 of them to leave in 4.5 years. And in both cases, that was to do the legal issues that I won't go into right now. But it was very clear they had to go. But in terms of culture and communities, be guided by the people in your space, be guided by your team. And this comes back to the first point around being humble and listening. I'm really obsessed with this right now, this notion of how we think about hierarchy, how we think about leadership. In the old days, it tended to be triangles, and increasingly I think of it as being circles. This is something that I think Google has taught me more than any other workplace. But I've been lucky enough to always work with teams where any idea coming from anywhere is really valued and debated. And increasingly, how can we design spaces in our offices and in our lives that are inherently collaborative? So one thing that we recently did, we have, as I mentioned, a really small cafe of 120 desks. We recently revised the floor plan, so it's very hard for any desk to be facing just the wall. And actually, a lesson that we learned there is sometimes people come there to work rather than to meet people, and we have to be okay with that. So we tried to bring in this startup called Coffee Labs, which match people up serendipitously for these random coffees. Some people loved it, some people really, really, really hated it and told us. And I think the lesson there is design for circles, not triangles, but also be really comfortable with people don't want to engage with you. If people want to come in, get their work done and leave, we're okay with that as well. It very much is, the way that I think about campus is it's very much what you make of it. And this goes back to inclusivity. I think for me, it was always personally very important to design a space that worked for all kinds of founder. I think we all know the best innovation comes by and for everybody. And there's a lot of data showing that diverse teams build better companies. But you have to earn the right to be a safe space. You can't just say you're a safe space. So I think through running ongoing programs over the course of 4.5 years for mums, founders of colour, we're doing a lot more right now with, in particular, we have a growing trans community that we're trying to be thoughtful about. How do we make this space work for everybody? How do I give my team the psychological safeness to come up with ideas that might otherwise be rejected? So for example, I was talking to my new facilities assistant yesterday, and he was like, oh, by the way, these windows need to be changed because of X, Y, Z. And I was talking to somebody last night,
about how in our first couple of jobs, we would never have dared to approach our boss's boss with something like that. And again, this goes back to hierarchies, right? This goes back to you being really open and listening to this kind of feedback. Because the best ideas, I promise you, will not come from you. They'll come from somebody in your community. And I think really over time, we've kind of led as much as we can with kind of trust and putting our community first. And that's made people think of us as being a space that is inclusive, that is friendly, that is welcoming. And again, I guess keep delighting. I think particularly in the startup world, a lot of the language can be, for me, a bit distasteful. And I'm thinking of words like hustle. I'm thinking of things like crushing your opposition. That's language that doesn't really appeal to me personally so well. I'm really fond of delighting communities. I think in every community that I've been part of, small things count. This guy, he's one of our youngest members. He's 13 years old. Technically, the age limit is 14, but I think it's okay. We got him a birthday cake, and he just was really thrilled. And this kind of thing is not always possible with a community of 65,000 members, but I think these moments, every week my team does a kind of learn and share. So one of my team right now is doing a machine learning masterclass. None of us understand it, but we're trying to through her. I think again, leaning on the expertise of other people and showing leadership by delighting members of your community, members of your teams can be really powerful. Yeah, I just want to apologize. I did not realize I'd be following you today. I'm sorry. The slide was done some time ago. I just always think about this slide because journalists are always like, oh, what's your hot tip for a startup? And I'm like, no one knows the future. No one can predict the future. It's kind of impossible. I guess it's getting the balance right between being flexible and being focused, right? So to Herb's point, my team know where they're going. They know the ultimate goal. We have ways of tracking and measuring that, but things are always shifting and changing. Our programs shift so enormously over time. I think right now across the UK, I'm hearing, there's a lot of talk about scale-ups, but I think no one really knows what that means. And no one really understands what those founders need. And the only people that can tell you what they need is the founders themselves. So it goes back to listening, and it goes back to being flexible, which I think is basically my one point that I'm hammering across. But I always go back to this thing. There's no way anybody would want a computer in their home. It's really easy to make these great sounding pronouncements, but yes, no one really knows the future. So always be comfortable with like a tiny bit of chaos. And my final point, I love what I do, but it's just work. Ultimately, the things that I love doing most of all are kind of working with founders day in, day out. Bad days, good days. I've recently begun a coaching course because I keep being asked to mediate between co-founder breakups, and I realized I'm not able to do that. I should get some training first. I was talking earlier to Matt about Singapore, and they have a large population of elderly people there living in state-controlled flats. And the government are bringing in all of these fantastic bits of tech, things like hologram doctors, Paro, the robot seal, who many of you might have seen in Master of None with Aziz Ansari. But I think Amber and I were talking about this earlier. Humans are cheaper than robot seals. But sometimes it seems easier to think of a tech solution for these problems. Sometimes the low-tech solution is best. So a lot of what we do at campus is based on the premise that paper and notice boards can work. Human connections matter. Physical space matters. Eye contact is powerful. And the best connections you make are often in the coffee queue or next to you at dinner, rather than online introductions. It's something that I personally really believe in. And I think whatever space you work in, whether it's a team of 3, whether it's a co-working space of 65,000, hopefully some things that I've talked about make sense. Thank you.